Okay, so we are going to start by reading Mary Slessor, Forward into Calabar. Chapter 1. The Vice Consul of Okiong. The hot West African sun beat down on the clearing at the edge of the village. It was after mid-noon, and the court hearing that had started early in the morning was dragging on. Akpano, his near-naked body glistening in the sun, was once again making a spirited argument as to why his brother-in-law should be forced to pay back the money he owed him. The vice-consul of Okiong sat cross-legged in the shade of a huge kapok tree, listening to the argument as she skillfully worked the knitting needles in her hands, passing the wool and yarn over the end of each needle to form a new stitch. The knitting seemed to have been claiming effect on her and on the crowd who had gathered to view the proceedings. The vice-consul had already heard Akpakno make his argument at least 20 times and listened as Akpakno's brother-in-law refuted it each time. She could tell the men were beginning to tire of talking, and soon it would be her turn to take over and render judgment. Experience had taught her that it was important for those involved in the case to talk about it until they could talk no more and were ready to listen as to what she had to say. It amazed Mary Slessor, the blue-eyed, red-haired Scottish woman who served as vice-consul, that she was the one deciding such disputes, and so many people came to observe the proceedings. When Mary first entered the Okiong region years before, people had fled from her in terror. They had never seen a white woman before, and they took her red hair as a sign that her head was on fire. But over the years, Mary had won the trust of the people in the region. Now the people called her the White Ma. Instead of fleeing, they flocked around her. No one had done more than the White Ma to change the cruel and inhuman customs and practices that had once terrorized the people's lives for so many years. Mary focused her attention on the case. Akpakno's brother-in-law was now wrapping up another rebuttal to Akpakno's argument, and it was time for Mary to start thinking and render judgment. The decision was cut and dry, really, but Mary still had a few things to think on. She was irritated that Akpano would take his brother-in-law to court when he himself neglected his children and took delight in regularly beating his wives, especially the wife who was the sister of the man he had dragged into court. What troubled Mary the most was that the brother-in-law was a hard-working, honorable man who had simply had some bad luck. So while the case was plain and simple, the brother-in-law owed the money and needed to pay it back. Mary was concerned that justice being administered in a broader sense, besides understanding that debts needed to be repaid, people needed to see that it wasn't okay to neglect your children or beat your wives. Mary sat knitting in silence, mulling over what to do. After several minutes, she laid aside her knitting and got up to her feet. Looking at Akpakno's brother-in-law squarely in the face, she said, "I find you guilty and order you to pay Akpakno the money you owe." Dejected at losing, the brother-in-law dropped his head. At the same time, a large smirk crept across Akpakno's face. But Mary had a surprise in store for Akpakno. She spoke again to the brother-in-law. "I also order you to give Akpakno a whipping, right here and now. And be sure you make it hard, or I will fine you for going easy on him." The look of shock quickly replaced the smirk on Akpakno's face. At the same time, looks of satisfaction crept across the faces of those in the crowd. This was their kind of justice. The White Ma truly understood their ways. With her duties as vice-consul discharged for the day, Mary gathered up her knitting, placed it into her bag. It was time to eat, and then share more of the gospel message with her village. In the morning, Mary would begin to trek back to Akenge, the village where she lived. As she sat at the fire that night eating a bowl of corn stew with her fingers, Mary wondered what the people back at the Baxton Cotton Mill in Dundee, Scotland, would think if they saw her now. They probably would be amazed that she had managed to stay alive for so long in such a harsh environment, especially when so many other missionaries had died within a few years of arriving in Calabar. They might also marvel at the fact that the 11-year-old girl who had started out working at the mill was now vice consul, the sole administrator of British law in the Okyong region. Of course, Mary would not have believed it possible back then either. But here she was. There was no denying it. She had grown a lot from being that small girl working at the mill. In fact, she now felt more at home among the people of the Okyong region than she did among the Scottish people in Scotland. Indeed, she now referred to the Africans as her people, and they referred to her as the mother of us all. It was all a long way from the life she lived in Dundee. Chapter 2.